Today we're going to build this mid-century modern style dining table inspired by my buddy Jory Brigham. I'm going to start by making a leg template out of 1/4-inch plywood. A 15-degree miter on each end lets the legs sit at 15 degrees. A taper is added to the inside of the leg, increasing the angle by 5 degrees. The template is then used to select the leg stock. While I'm at it, I'll also cut my short and long rail pieces, trying my best to avoid the sapwood. I mean, I like sapwood on occasion, but I'm just not looking for a permanent relationship with it on this piece. Each component is trimmed up at the bandsaw and cut to rough length at the chop saw. Let's focus on the legs first. We'll mill them flat and square. The foot is trimmed to 15 degrees. Then we can use the template to set up the stop. And this allows us to trim the top of the leg to the same 15-degree angle. The inside tapered edge of the leg is still rough, and to trim those perfectly, I'll make up a simple tapering jig. Using a template for reference on a piece of 1/2-inch stock, I'll attach some plywood strips as stops. The leg blanks should drop right into place. And to further secure the legs, I'll use the CA Glue blue tape trick. Now I can easily rip the tapers. Let's turn our attention to the aprons. We'll mill them flat and square and then plane them to thickness. The aprons will actually be a little bit thinner than the legs, allowing for a 1/4-inch reveal. The long aprons are ripped to 3.5 inches wide. The short aprons are ripped a little bit wider to account for the fact that they'll sit at an angle and will receive 2 bevel cuts. That'll make sense later. The ends of the long aprons need a miter cut that matches the inside angle of the legs, so that's 20 degrees. The short aprons get a standard 90-degree cut. I'm going to use dominoes to put this thing together, so I use some marks on my template to transfer the joint locations to the legs and long aprons. The legs and long aprons are flush on the inside with a 1/4-inch reveal on the outside, so we'll reference the domino from the inside faces. Let's do a little dry assembly, just to make sure there were no inadvertent brain farts. Now, the short aprons are just a little bit trickier. I'll line one of the aprons up at the proper angle with a 1/4-inch reveal that we want, and strike a pencil line at the top to remind me of the bevel direction. I can then use my bevel gauge to lock in the exact angle. That angle is transferred to the table saw, and the bevels are cut on the top and bottom edges of the short aprons. By the way, this is why the short aprons were initially cut wider than the long aprons. The bevel cuts reduce the width. With a center line drawn on the apron and the apron set back with the 1/4-inch reveal, I can transfer the center line to the leg. That's the line that I need for setting the fence on the domino. The other lines will come from 2 little layout guides that I made. One for the legs and one for the aprons. Usually, I just use an adjustable square for this kind of thing, but when you're working with bevels, things can get wonky. I know lots of people get uptight when they see someone use the domino. After all, it's woodworking on easy mode. but there's nothing that you can do with a domino that you can't do with a router and a little forethought. The domino just saves me a day or two of additional work and gets this table in Jason's house that much faster. The fence on a domino is raised for the cuts on the legs. We just use that pencil line that we drew earlier to line things up. So let's see how we did. It's not too shabby. Now let's jazz up the legs a bit. We'll add a tapered bevel on all four corners. They start wide at the bottom and then taper off to nothing at the top. With the bandsaw table at 45 degrees, which is a little scary, I'll freehand a rough cut to remove the bulk. Then I can use a block plane to clean it up and work back to the lines. I get a lot of questions about why I skew my planes. When planing a rough surface like this, skewing the plane allows me to work faster and be more aggressive by reducing the amount of the sole that's in contact with the wood. The skew angle also tends to leave a cleaner cut. I've also been getting a lot of questions about my fancy wrist decoration. No, I don't have a bowling match after work. I actually have a touch of the tendinitis. I'm supposed to be resting my wrist, but you can see how well I'm obeying the doctor's request. Since the short aprons sit at an angle and the bevel we cut creates an even sharper corner than usual, I decided to add an additional chamfer to lessen the chance that one of my nieces will smack one of their cute little heads right into it. Now for some sanding. I'll take all surfaces to 180 grit while easing all the exposed edges. For the glue up, I'll need some angled cawls to offset the angle of the legs, so I'll cut some out of scrap wood. The glue up itself is pretty straightforward. Glue in the mortises and on the tendons. And a little clamping pressure to bring it all together. After the long aprons are glued up, we can add the short aprons to complete the base. Look, Ma, I made a thing! Now we have a rare look at two males of the species, deciding whether the brown-colored stuff is good for eating. It's not good for eating, but it's great for making a tabletop. We're selecting the best 72-inch sections of each board and trying to avoid sapwood if possible. Each board is jointed on a face and on an edge. We can then send the boards through the planer. We have a lot of extra width here, which is good because there's a lot of flaws that need to be cut away. After a round of edge cuts, we can bring the boards together to see where we're at. I still want to joint all of the edges one more time before glue up, so I like to have at least a 1/4 inch overage at this point. Now with the boards butted up and in order, I mark lines for some dominoes. We don't really need the dominoes for strength, but they will make life easier when it comes to alignment. Sometimes I put glue on both edges, sometimes I put it on one. If you only put glue on one edge, make sure you're generous about it. You still want to see some squeeze out when the clamping pressure is applied. To help balance the pressure and keep the top flat, we'll run a few clamps in the opposite orientation. Check out that sweet line of squeeze out. We have a few cracks and knots to fill, so I'll squirt out some epoxy and add dark brown dye to it. For the crack, we'll use blue tape to reduce the amount of staining. Heating the epoxy makes it less viscous and more likely to seep down further into the crack. We can also encourage it to go deeper with a little bit of suction from underneath. And that, my friends, is my only contribution to the world of epoxy river tables. Once the epoxy is dry, we can scrape the bulk away and the surface is ready for finish prep. We'll use a cabinet scraper to knock down the glue and any major high spots, and then proceed to a thorough sanding. The ends of the tabletop are squared up using the track saw. The top is too thick as is, so to give it the appearance of a slightly thinner top, while retaining the thickness we want, we'll add a 1/2 inch deep by 5 inch wide shallow bevel to the entire perimeter. If I had an electric hand planer, I'd use that, but I don't, so I'm using an angle grinder with a carving disc to remove the bulk. Next, I'll use a jack plane to knock down the high stuff and bring the edge right down to the line. Now I can use a belt sander to clean up the rest of the bevel. After that, the random orbit sander refines the surface. This is a lot of work for a minor detail, but it's one of those things people really like when they encounter it. Is it worth the effort? I don't know. We'll finish off the top with an 1/8 inch roundover. Even though I plan on using an oil-based finish and oil doesn't really raise the grain very much, I'm water popping the top just to ensure that it's as smooth as possible. Finally, we'll apply the hard wax oil. I always admire how people can apply this stuff with such smooth and graceful motions. My method looks a lot more like a drunk guy in a bar trying to mop up his own vomit. But hey, I gets the schmutz on the wood, and that's all that matters. We're actually using walnut colored finish here. Normally, I wouldn't add color to walnut, but I had a bunch of this stuff left over from a flooring project inside my house, so this was a good opportunity to use it up. And it really isn't going to change the color that much, but perhaps maybe it'll prevent the walnut from lightening up a lot, which is something that happens over time. For the base, we'll apply the finish by hand. To attach the top to the base, I'll use some Izzy skirt washers. These things are great. Just use a Forstner bit to embed them in the rails with a screw. Then drive another screw up into the tabletop. The shape of the washers allows the top to expand and contract while being held securely to the base. We'll spend a few minutes getting the top centered, and then attach it to the base. And that, my friends, is a dining table. It stands 30 inches tall and has lots of fun little details and lines you can discover if you just look for them. I think Jay and his family are really going to enjoy this. By the way, if you're a fan of mid-century modern furniture and Jory Brigham, you might want to check out his Hank chair build in the Wood Whisperer Guild. Jory has a wonderful eye for design and shows us all of his tips and tricks for making this gorgeous chair. Available now in the Wood Whisperer Guild. Toodles!